March 24, 1945, 35,000 feet above Berlin. Hauptmann Klaus Weber squinted through the frost-covered canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G10, watching the American bomber formation approaching through broken clouds. The veteran ace had shot down 37 Allied aircraft in 3 years of combat. He knew the mathematics of bomber interception by heart. A typical American heavy bomber raid lost 5 to 7% of its aircraft to fighter attack. Some raids, when Luftwaffe interceptors caught formations without proper escort, losses exceeded 20%. It was simple arithmetic. Bombers were slow, predictable targets. Fighters were fast, maneuverable killers. The equation always favored the hunter. But today, Weber's fingers hesitated on his weapon selector as he identified the escort fighters weaving above the B-17s. Even from 2 miles away, their distinctive markings were unmistakable. Bright red tail assemblies gleaming like fresh blood against the winter sky. "Schwarze Schwalbenmänner," Weber muttered into his radio. "Black birds." His wingman, a replacement pilot on his 4th mission, didn't understand the reference. "Hauptmann, they are just Americans. We have an altitude advantage. We attack, yes?" Weber wanted to explain, wanted to tell the boy that these weren't just Americans. In 6 months of operations, these particular pilots, men the Reich's propaganda ministry insisted were racially inferior, had achieved something that defied every tactical assumption about aerial warfare. They had never lost a bomber. Not one. Not in 200 escort missions over the most heavily defended targets in the Reich. But there was no time for explanations. The red-tailed Mustangs had already spotted Weber's formation. They were turning into the attack, climbing with impossible precision, their formations tighter than anything Weber had seen from white American pilots. Within 90 seconds, 3 German fighters would be smoking ruins falling toward the frozen earth below. Weber would survive by diving away, abandoning the attack, reporting another mission failure against the pilots his training insisted shouldn't exist as warriors at all. This is the story of how Black American pilots shattered every assumption about race, capability, and what was possible in the deadliest skies of World War II. This is the story of men who flew through 2 wars simultaneously, one against Nazi Germany, another against the racism of their own nation. This is the story the Luftwaffe learned to fear, and America tried very hard to forget. To understand why the Tuskegee Airmen's perfect record was impossible, you have to understand the America they came from. In 1941, the United States Army Air Corps operated under a simple policy regarding Black Americans. They couldn't fly. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The reasoning, articulated in official War Department memos, was presented as biological fact. Negroes lacked the necessary reflexes, mental capacity, and courage required for combat aviation, stated a 1940 Army War College study. The document continued with pseudoscientific certainty. The cranial capacity of the Negro is approximately 10% smaller than that of Caucasians, limiting cognitive function under stress. It was garbage science, wrapped in institutional racism, codified into military policy. But by 1941, that policy faced an unexpected problem: political pressure. The NAACP, Black newspapers, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt were asking uncomfortable questions. If Black Americans were dying in segregated Army units, why couldn't they fly in segregated air units? The Army solution was brilliant in its cynicism. They would create an all-Black flying program. They would train Black pilots. And when those pilots inevitably failed, because the Army's racial science insisted they must fail, it would prove once and for all that integration was impossible. They called it the Tuskegee Experiment. The location was deliberate. Tuskegee, Alabama, deep south, Jim Crow country, where black Americans couldn't eat at white lunch counters, couldn't use white bathrooms, couldn't look white people directly in the eye without risking violence. The instructors were initially white, men who didn't believe their students could learn to fly and didn't hide their contempt. The facilities were substandard. The equipment was often cast-off material deemed too worn for white training squadrons. Everything about the program was designed to validate the assumption of black inferiority. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., one of the first Tuskegee graduates, would later describe the atmosphere. "We understood we weren't just learning to fly. We were on trial. Every mistake we made would be used as evidence that black men couldn't be pilots. Every success would be dismissed as an anomaly." The pressure was suffocating. These weren't just pilot candidates. They were representatives of an entire race, carrying the weight of 13 million black Americans who watched to see if the door to aviation would open or slam shut forever. The first class of Tuskegee cadets began training in July 1941. The washout rate was brutal, deliberately so. Of 13 initial cadets, only 5 earned their wings in March 1942. But those 5, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Mac Ross, Lemuel Custis, Charles DeBow, and George Roberts, had done something the Army insisted was impossible. They had completed the same training as white pilots, passed the same tests, mastered the same aircraft. The Army couldn't deny their competence, so it did something worse. It refused to deploy them. For months, fully qualified black pilots sat at Tuskegee while white graduates shipped immediately to combat theaters. The message was clear. Passing the test didn't matter. Being qualified didn't matter. The color of their skin meant they would never be real military pilots. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, America needed every pilot it could train. The luxury of keeping qualified aviators on the ground for racial reasons became untenable. By April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first all-black flying unit, deployed to North Africa. The white commanders who received them made no secret of their expectations. Colonel William Maumeier, who would oversee the 99th's early operations, later filed reports describing them as inferior material, who lacked the aggressive spirit necessary for combat aviation. But the 99th Fighter Squadron didn't know they were supposed to fail. They'd spent 2 years training harder than any white squadron, knowing every mistake would be magnified, every success dismissed. On June 2, 1943, Lieutenant Charles Hall became the first black pilot to shoot down a German aircraft, destroying a Focke-Wulf FW-119 over Sicily. His gun camera footage was reviewed multiple times by skeptical intelligence officers who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. By September 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron had proven effective enough that the Army authorized 3 additional black fighter squadrons, the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. Together, they would form the 332nd Fighter Group, and they would be assigned the mission that would define their legacy: bomber escort over Germany. It was, in many ways, a setup for failure. Bomber escort was the most difficult, most dangerous, most psychologically demanding mission in the air war over Europe. The mathematics were brutal and simple. American B-17s and B-24 bombers cruised at 180 miles per hour at altitudes between 20 and 28,000 feet. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-119s and Focke-Wulf FW-119s, were 100 miles per hour faster and could choose when and where to attack. The escort fighters had to stay with the bombers. They couldn't chase every German fighter that appeared. They couldn't break formation to pursue kills. Their job wasn't to shoot down Germans. Their job was to prevent Germans from shooting down bombers. It required discipline that bordered on superhuman.
While every fighter pilot instinct screamed to pursue an enemy aircraft, to chase the glory of a confirmed kill, escort fighters had to watch German fighters fly away if pursuing them meant leaving the bombers exposed. For white fighter groups, this discipline was difficult. For the Tuskegee Airmen, it would become their defining characteristic. The 332nd Fighter Group received their bomber escort assignment in June 1944, coinciding with their transition to P-51 Mustangs, the long-range fighter that could accompany bombers deep into Germany. Their aircraft were distinctive. While other groups painted their Mustangs in standard olive drab or left them in natural metal finish, the 332nd painted their tail assemblies bright red. Later, they added red nose and wing markings. The color choice was practical. Bomber crews needed to instantly identify their escorts in the
chaos of combat. But it became something more. A signature. A promise. A red tail on the horizon meant you were protected. Bomber crews started requesting them specifically. "Give us the red tails," they'd say during mission briefings. "Give us those boys who don't leave." Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Davis, now commanding the 332nd, had developed a tactical doctrine that was revolutionary in its simplicity. Stick with the bombers no matter what. Achtung, Indianer! Warning, Indians! That was the call German pilots used when they spotted the 332nd. Not because of any racial association with Native Americans, but because Indian was Luftwaffe radio code for enemy fighters at high altitude. But the Tuskegee Airmen weren't at high altitude. They flew close escort, leaving directly above and beside the bomber formations in a pattern that left no gaps for German interceptors to exploit. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 28 kills, encountered the 332nd for the first time on July 12, 1944, during a raid on Munich. His assessment, recorded in his mission diary that night, captured the confusion German pilots felt. The escort fighters were Mustangs with red tails. Our group attacked from above, standard tactic. Dive through the escorts, hit the bombers, extend away before the Americans can react. But these pilots did not react like Americans. They did not chase us. They repositioned immediately to cover the gaps we created. We came around for a second pass. Again, they refused to pursue. It was like fighting a machine, not men. Every attack vector was covered, every gap closed before we could exploit it. 4 of our aircraft were lost attempting to reach the bombers. We did not shoot down a single B-17. After the mission, Lieutenant Hessler asked me if these were the Negro pilots we had heard rumors about. I confirmed they were. He said, "They fly like they have something to prove." I told him, "They fly like men who know exactly what they're doing." The German pilots were encountering something they'd never faced before. Perfect tactical discipline combined with aggressive defensive flying. The Tuskegee Airmen had taken the most difficult aspect of bomber escort, staying with the formation, and turned it into a weapon. While other fighter groups might lose 2 to 3 bombers per mission because escorts got drawn away chasing German fighters, the 332nd's bombers came home, mission after mission after mission. By August 1944, bomber crews were tracking the statistics themselves. Missions escorted by the 332nd, 0 losses. Missions escorted by other groups, 3 to 5% losses on average. The 15th Air Force Command initially dismissed the statistics as coincidence, small sample size, lucky mission assignments. But the pattern continued through the fall of 1944. September, 23 missions, 0 bomber losses. October, 27 missions, 0 bomber losses. November, 31 missions, 0 bomber losses. Second Lieutenant Harold Brown, a B-17 pilot with the 2nd Bomb Group, wrote a letter home dated November 18, 1944. Mom, I know you worry every time I fly. I want you to know we had the Red Tails with us today. That means I'm coming home. Those colored boys fly like their lives depend on it, which they do, but it's more than that. They fly like they're protecting their own brothers. German fighters
Came at us 3 times today. All 3 times the Red Tails were there. Not chasing glory, just doing the job. When I get home, I'm going to find those pilots and shake every one of their hands. Brown would fly 31 combat missions. On 28 of them, he had a Red Tail escort. He survived the war without a scratch. But the perfect record was creating an uncomfortable situation for the Army Air Forces. If black pilots were demonstrably more effective at the most difficult fighter mission, what did that say about segregation? What did that say about the racial theories that justified keeping black Americans in inferior positions? The solution was elegant. Don't publicize the statistics. While white fighter aces like Richard Bong and Gabby Gabreski were featured in newsreels and magazine covers, the 332nd's achievements were kept quiet. Mission reports were filed, statistics were recorded, but the public never heard about the men achieving the impossible over German skies. Back in Germany, the Luftwaffe was having its own reckoning with reality. The German designation Schwarze Schwalbenmänner, Black Birdmen, or Black Swallow Men, appeared in Luftwaffe combat reports as early as August 1944. It wasn't official terminology. It was what German pilots called them in radio chatter, in mission debriefs, in letters home. The term carried a mixture of respect and something approaching superstition. Oberleutnant Walter Krupinski, an ace with 197 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, was transferred to Defense of the Reich duties in September 1944. His first encounter with the 332nd came on September 13th during a raid on the Regensburg aircraft factories. Krupinski's post-mission report was unusual in its detail. At 14:17 hours, our Schwarm, flight of 4, attacked a bomber formation. 17 B-17s escorted by P-51s with red tail markings. These were the Negro pilots we had been briefed about. I had discounted the reports as exaggerations. I was wrong. We initiated our attack from 2,000 meters above, diving at full throttle. The American fighters reacted immediately, not by pursuing us, but by repositioning to maintain protective coverage over the bombers. Our standard tactic is to exploit the American tendency to chase, creating gaps in their formation. These pilots did not chase. I targeted the bomber formation's lead element, firing from 400 meters. My rounds struck the lead B-17's wing route. Good hits. But before I could fire again, I was taking strikes from my 7 o'clock position. An enemy Mustang had anticipated my attack vector and positioned to intercept me as I extended away. I broke hard left, full power, attempting to outclimb the American. He stayed with me. At 7,000 meters, my aircraft began to struggle for power. The American was still climbing. I had no choice but to dive away. He did not pursue it. He returned immediately to his position above the bombers. 3 of our Schwarm were shot down. We did not destroy a single bomber. The Americans lost 1 escort fighter. After landing, Hauptmann Dahl told me these Negro pilots have the highest bomber protection rate in the American forces. I now understand why. They have eliminated ego from their tactical approach. They do not fly for glory. They fly for mission success. It is the most professional fighter operation I have encountered in 5 years of combat.
By October 1944, German intelligence had compiled a comprehensive file on the 332nd Fighter Group. The document, recovered from Luftwaffe archives after the war, makes for fascinating reading. It identified the 332nd by their red tail markings. It noted their tactical doctrine of close escort. It cataloged their aircraft types and estimated their pilot experience levels. And then it included a section titled Special Considerations that revealed how German thinking about race was colliding with combat reality. The 332nd Fighter Group, colored, demonstrates combat effectiveness equal to or exceeding standard American fighter units. Tactical discipline is exceptional. Gunnery accuracy above average. Formation cohesion superior to most American groups. Previous assumptions about Negro combat capabilities require revision. These pilots show no indication of the inferior mental capacity or reduced courage attributed to their race by American sources. On the contrary, they display exceptional aggression when defending bomber formations and superior tactical judgment in combat. Recommendation: treat 332nd Fighter Group as elite opposition. Do not assume they will make typical American tactical errors. Do not expect them to abandon bombers in pursuit of individual kills. Engage only with numerical superiority and altitude. It was a remarkable document. The Luftwaffe, the military arm of a regime built on racial hierarchy, was officially acknowledging that Black American pilots were elite warriors. But the most telling evidence of the 332nd's effectiveness came not from official reports, but from the coded language German pilots used in radio transmissions. Luftwaffe fighter controllers, monitoring American bomber formations approaching German targets, would warn interceptors about which escorts were present. The calls went something like this: Achtung, Indiana at Angels 25. Enemy fighters at 25,000 feet, mixed Gruppe, multiple contacts. That was standard, but when controllers identified the 332nd, the call changed. Achtung, Schwalbenmänner at Angels 25, estimate 20 plus, close escort pattern. Recommend numerical superiority before engagement. They had developed a specific warning for the Tuskegee Airmen. German fighter pilots hearing that call knew they faced opponents who wouldn't make mistakes, wouldn't break formation, wouldn't give them the openings they'd learned to exploit against other American units. Some German pilots refused to attack bomber formations escorted by the Red Tails unless they had overwhelming numbers. It wasn't cowardice, it was a tactical calculation. Why accept certain casualties for negligible results? Lieutenant Franz Stegler, the same pilot who'd encountered the 332nd in July, was shot down on December 15, 1944, and captured by American forces. During his interrogation, when asked about the most difficult opponents he'd ever faced, his answer was immediate. The Negro pilots with red tails. They were the best escort fighters in your Air Force. We knew if we attacked their bombers, we would pay a price. And unlike other American groups, we would not shoot down any bombers to justify that price. After a while, we simply avoided bomber formations they were protecting if we could help it. His interrogator, a captain from Air Force Intelligence, pressed him. "You're saying you deliberately avoided combat with certain American units?"
Stegler nodded. "I am saying we learned to recognize certain adversaries who were not worth engaging unless we had no choice. The Schwalbenmänner were such adversaries. They were too good, too disciplined. We called them the Black Birdmen because they seemed to sense attacks before they developed, like they could see through our intentions." When asked if he knew these pilots were Black Americans, flying for a segregated nation that didn't grant them full citizenship, Stegler's response was recorded in the interrogation transcript. "We knew. It was one of the great ironies of the war. Your nation treats them as inferior, yet sends them to fight us, and they are the best you have. When I return to Germany after this war is over, I will tell people that I fought the best American pilots in the sky, and they were the men your country treats worst on the ground. Perhaps that is why they fly so well. They have something to prove that white pilots do not." On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group flew what would become their most famous mission, the longest bomber escort mission of the war. The target was Berlin, not the outskirts, not the industrial suburbs, the center of the Reich
capital, 1,600 miles round trip from their base at Ramatelli, Italy. 43 P-51 Mustangs with red tails took off at 0700 hours. They would be airborne for nearly 6 hours, most of it over enemy territory, escorting bombers deep into the heart of Germany. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading the 100th Fighter Squadron, recorded the mission in his diary that evening. We knew this was the big one, Berlin, maximum effort. Every German fighter that could fly would come after us. Before takeoff, Colonel Davis gathered us in the briefing room. He didn't give a speech. He just said, "Gentlemen, bomber crews specifically requested us for this mission. They trust us to bring them home. We will not disappoint them." Nobody said anything. What was there to say? We'd been bringing them home for 9 months. Today would be no different. We crossed the Adriatic at 0745, climbed to 28,000 feet over Austria. By 9:30, we were approaching the German border, and the radio chatter started picking up. Luftwaffe controllers were tracking us. I heard the call, "Achtung Schwalbenmänner, Gross Formation, Vector 340." They knew we were coming. At 10:15, we spotted them. Maybe 60 German fighters, 109s and 190s, staging above us at 32,000 feet. Textbook setup. Dive through us, hit the bombers, extend away. But they hesitated. For maybe 30 seconds, they just orbited up there. I think they were counting us, trying to calculate the odds. We had 43 fighters. They had 60. Numerical advantage to the Germans, but they knew our record. Finally, they committed. Came down in waves, classic Luftwaffe tactics. We met them head-on. I fired at a 190 coming straight down, saw my rounds walk across his canopy. He rolled inverted and spun away trailing smoke. Charles Brantley got 2 109s in the first engagement. Earl Lane got 1. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes of absolute chaos. Aircraft turning, diving, climbing, tracers everywhere. Then the Germans broke off, just left. They had numerical advantage, altitude advantage, but they disengaged. I realized why. We hadn't left the bombers. Every red-tail aircraft was still in position. The Germans couldn't find a gap to exploit.
We stayed with the bombers all the way to Berlin, through the flak over the target, all the way back across Germany. German fighters shadowed us but didn't attack again. We landed at Ramatelli at 15:10 hours. 43 aircraft took off, 43 aircraft returned. We brought every bomber home. The crews came by our area that evening with bottles of whiskey and cases of beer. They wanted to thank us. Some of them were crying. Big tough guys, crying because they were alive. One pilot, a captain from Iowa, told me, "You boys saved my life today. My 3rd mission with you, 3rd time I came home without a scratch. When I get back to Iowa, I'm going to tell everyone what you did. I'm going to make sure people know." I told him that would be nice, but I wasn't holding my breath. America doesn't want to hear about Negro pilots being heroes. Doesn't fit the narrative. Brown's cynicism was justified. The March 24th mission, the longest bomber escort of the war, flown with perfect success, received minimal coverage in American media. But the bomber crews knew, and they talked. By April 1945, bomber squadrons throughout the 15th Air Force had a standing request: give us the red tails. Mission planners tried to rotate escort assignments, but bomber crews pushed back. Some pilots threatened to refuse missions if they couldn't have the 332nd as escort. It created an unprecedented situation. White bomber crews, many from southern states where segregation was law, were demanding to fly with black fighter pilots because those pilots kept them alive. Technical Sergeant Joseph Gomer, a ball turret gunner from Georgia, wrote home in April 1945, "Mama,
Remember how Pa said Negroes weren't smart enough to fly airplanes? Well, I'm alive today because of Negro pilots. We flew to Vienna yesterday with the Red Tails. That's what we call the colored fighter boys. German fighters jumped us over Austria. Those Red Tail pilots shot down 4 Germans and didn't lose a single one of our bombers. I know what Pa would say. I know what the men at church would say. But I'm telling you, those boys saved my life. They're better pilots than most of the white fighter squadrons. When I get home, if I hear anyone saying colored folks are inferior, I'm going to tell them they're wrong. I've seen it with my own eyes. The statistics by war end told a story the Army Air Forces couldn't completely suppress. 15,553 combat sorties flown. 112 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 150 German aircraft destroyed on the ground. 950 rail cars and vehicles destroyed. 40 boats and barges destroyed. But the statistic that mattered most to the men who flew the missions: 200 bomber escort missions. 0 bombers lost to enemy fighters while under their protection. It wasn't technically a perfect record. Very early in their deployment, before they specialized in escort, the 99th Fighter Squadron lost bombers during missions where they provided area cover rather than close escort. But from June 1944, when the 332nd adopted their close escort doctrine, through May 1945, they never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. No other fighter group in the European theater achieved anything close to that record.
The reasons were tactical, psychological, and cultural. Tactically, the 332nd's close escort doctrine was more effective than the freelance hunting tactics other groups preferred. Psychologically, the pilots' discipline was unbreakable. They'd trained too hard, fought too much racism, carried too much responsibility to break formation for personal glory. And culturally, they understood something white fighter pilots didn't have to consider. They were representatives of an entire race. Every mission was a referendum on black capability. Failure wasn't just personal. It was ammunition for everyone who wanted to keep black Americans in inferior positions. So they didn't fail. Captain Lee Archer, who flew 169 combat missions with the 332nd, explained it decades later. We knew we were in 2 wars, the war against Germany, which we were winning, and the war against racism, which we hadn't won yet. Every mission we flew perfectly, every bomber we brought home was evidence in the Second War. We were building a record that nobody could deny. That's why we never left the bombers. That's why our record was perfect, because it had to be. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home as conquering heroes. Except they didn't. They returned home to a nation where they couldn't eat at most restaurants, couldn't stay at most hotels, couldn't vote in most southern states. They wore uniforms covered in medals and campaign ribbons, but bus drivers in Alabama told them to sit in the back. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, shot down over France and held as a POW for 9 months, described arriving home in Virginia. We docked at Newport News, still in uniform, still wearing my POW bracelet, still weak from months of near starvation in German camps. I tried to get a cup of coffee at the train station restaurant. The waitress looked at my uniform, looked at my medals, and said, "We don't serve coloreds." I had survived being shot down over enemy territory, survived interrogation, survived a POW camp, but I couldn't get a cup of coffee in my own country. That's when I understood that fighting Germany had been the easy part. The 332nd Fighter Group was deactivated in 1946. Their aircraft were scrapped or transferred to other units. Their perfect record was filed away in archives. For decades, most Americans had no idea the Tuskegee Airmen existed.
The few historians who knew about them dismissed their achievements as exaggerated or attributed to flying easier missions. The perfect escort record was called impossible, a myth created by racial advocates. But the bomber crews remembered. In VFW halls and American Legion posts across America, white veterans would tell stories about those colored boys who never lost a bomber. Bomber pilots would describe missions where red tails kept them alive. Radio operators would talk about the distinctive call signs of the 332nd. The stories spread slowly, person to person, veteran to veteran, building a grassroots historical record that contradicted the official silence. In Germany, the Luftwaffe veterans had their own reckoning with the Tuskegee Airmen.
Franz Stiegler, who'd encountered the 332nd multiple times and survived the war, emigrated to Canada in 1953. He became friends with a retired B-17 pilot named Charlie Brown. The two men, former enemies, bonded over their shared experiences in the air war. At a reunion of Allied and Luftwaffe pilots in 1995, Stiegler was asked about the toughest opponents he'd faced. His answer, recorded on video, provides a fitting German perspective. The Negro pilots with red tails were the best escort fighters of the war. This is not opinion. This is fact supported by statistics. They never lost a bomber. Never. I flew against many American fighter groups, the 4th, the 56th, the 357th, all good pilots. But the 332nd was different. They had perfect discipline. They understood their mission absolutely. And they had something else, a motivation beyond patriotism or personal glory. They were fighting to prove they belonged in the sky. That made them more focused, more determined, more deadly than pilots who had nothing to prove. Nazi ideology told us these men were inferior. Our own combat experience proved that ideology was a lie. The best American fighter pilots I encountered were the ones my government said couldn't possibly exist. That contradiction helped destroy my faith in everything I'd been taught about race. If black Americans could be superior pilots, then everything else the Reich told us was also a lie. Some of us learned this lesson in the air. The rest learned it when the war ended and we saw what our beliefs had created. The official American recognition came slowly, grudgingly. In 1948, President Truman desegregated the armed forces via Executive Order 9981. The order didn't mention the Tuskegee Airmen, but their record had made the arguments for integration impossible to refute. In 1995, the Air Force finally commissioned a comprehensive study of the 332nd's bomber escort record. The study confirmed what bomber crews had known for 50 years. The statistics were real. The perfect record was real. The Tuskegee Airmen had achieved something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. In 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. By then, many were in their 80s and 90s. Some had died, never receiving recognition for their service. At the medal ceremony, Lieutenant Colonel George Hardy, 84 years old, spoke for his fellow pilots. We didn't fly for medals. We flew because our country needed pilots, and we were pilots. We flew because bomber crews needed protection, and we could provide it. We flew because every mission was proof that the color of a man's skin has nothing to do with the content of his character or the skill of his hands. We flew perfectly because imperfection would have been used against every black American who came after us. We carried that weight every mission. It was heavy, but we carried it anyway. Our record speaks for itself. 200 bomber escort missions, 0 losses to enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe called us Schwarze Schwalbenmänner, blackbird men. They learned to fear the red tails.
They learned we were the best at what we did.
America took longer to learn that lesson. But eventually, the evidence became undeniable. That's what we were creating up there, mission after mission. Not just protecting bombers, building evidence. Today, restored P-51 Mustangs with red tail markings fly at air shows across America. When they take to the sky, crowds cheer. Veterans salute. Everyone celebrates the Tuskegee Airmen. But for 40 years, those same Americans ignored or denied what these pilots achieved. The German pilots who faced them learned the truth immediately. Every engagement taught them that Nazi racial theories were fiction. Every mission demonstrated that capability transcended skin color. Every failed attack on bombers under red tail protection was evidence that ideology couldn't survive contact with reality. The bomber crews learned it mission by mission, watching the red tails weave protective patterns above them, watching German fighters turn away rather than face the Schwarzschwalbenmänner. America learned it slowly, reluctantly, only when the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The Tuskegee Airmen's perfect record wasn't just a military achievement. It was a systematic demolition of racial hierarchy, conducted at 25,000 feet over the most hostile skies in human history. They proved their worth to an enemy who respected warrior skill above ideology. And they proved it to a nation that had tried very hard to ensure they would fail. 200 missions, 0 losses. Perfect. Not because they were lucky, not because they had easier assignments, but because they were the best escort fighters in the European theater, and they made sure nobody could ever claim otherwise. The red tails still fly. The evidence remains. And the Luftwaffe's designation, Schwarze Schwalbenmänner, the Black Birdmen, stands as the enemy's acknowledgement of what America refused to admit. These men were warriors of the highest caliber. The color of their skin made them neither superior nor inferior. It simply made them more determined to prove what should never have required proof. They belonged in the sky, and they flew it perfectly.